There is a moment in every parent's life when the weight of what they have built begins to feel less like a gift, and less like a burden, and more like a question that has no clean answer. For Margaret Ellison, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of her 79th year, sitting at a mahogany desk in a lawyer's office in suburban Ohio, signing documents that would redirect approximately $2.4 million away from her 3 adult children and toward a network of charitable organizations she had carefully researched over 18 months. Her hands did not tremble. Her voice did not crack. She signed every page with the same quiet certainty she had used to build her business 40 years earlier, and when she was done, she looked up at her attorney and said, "That is the most honest thing I have done in years." What happened next would fracture her family in ways she had anticipated but never fully prepared for. Her eldest son, David, stopped returning her calls within the week. Her daughter, Carol, sent a letter that Margaret describes as the most painful piece of mail she has ever opened in her life. Her youngest, Thomas, drove 4 hours to her house, sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours, and left without eating the dinner she had prepared. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a house from the floors to the ceiling and leaves no room for anything else. But here is the thing about Margaret's story that makes it different from what you might expect. She is not cold. She is not eccentric. She is not suffering from any condition that has clouded her judgment. She is sharp, reflective, emotionally present, and deeply aware of the pain her decision has caused. She has thought about it for longer than most people think about any single decision in their entire lives. And when she sits down and explains her reasoning in her own words, something surprising happens. You begin to understand her, not just tolerate her perspective. You actually begin to understand it. This is not a story about a parent who stopped loving her children. It is a story about a parent who decided that love and inheritance are not the same thing, and that confusing the two had already cost her family more than she was willing to count. It is a story about money, certainly, but it is really a story about what money means to the people who spend their entire lives believing they are owed some of it simply because of whose body they came from. And the reason it matters, the reason stories like Margaret's have been spreading across living rooms and comment sections and family group chats for the past several years, is that Margaret is not alone. Not even close. Across the country, a growing number of older Americans are making the same choice, for deeply personal reasons that do not fit neatly into any category, and they are finding, almost universally, that the people who love them are the last people willing to accept it. Margaret grew up in a house where money was discussed the way weather was discussed, as something that happened to you, not something you shaped. Her father worked in a steel processing plant for 31 years. Her mother sewed alterations for a dry cleaner 2 days a week. They were not poor by any dramatic measure, but the margins were thin, and everyone in the household understood that without constant vigilance, the whole arrangement could tip. You did not waste. You did not indulge. And you most certainly did not talk about what you had, because talking about it felt like tempting it to disappear. When Margaret was 24, she took a job managing the accounts for a small printing company. Within 3 years, she had reorganized their billing system, renegotiated 2 supplier contracts, and proposed an expansion that the owner initially dismissed as too ambitious. He came around 18 months later, and when the expansion generated revenue that exceeded his most optimistic projections, he offered her a small ownership stake as a bonus. She accepted it. That stake, and the decisions she made over the following 2 decades, became the foundation of everything. By the time her children were in high school, Margaret had quietly accumulated a level of financial security that her parents could not have imagined. She had sold her stake in the printing company at exactly the right moment, invested conservatively but consistently, bought real estate in 2 markets before either of them appreciated significantly, and maintained a personal spending discipline that her children sometimes found frustrating. They grew up comfortable. They never went without anything essential. But they also grew up without knowing the full picture of what their mother had built, because Margaret believed, as many parents do, that telling children too much about wealth too early was its own kind of damage. What she did not anticipate was that children who grow up without being told a number often fill in the blank themselves. They construct a version of the inheritance in their imaginations, and that imagined version tends to grow over time in the same way that any story grows when it has no facts to push against it. By the time David, Carol, and Thomas were in their 40s, each of them carried a private assumption about what was coming to them, and each of those assumptions had quietly begun shaping decisions. A house purchased slightly beyond what was wise. A career pivot made with the comfortable knowledge that a net beneath the net existed. A retirement savings rate that was, by any objective measure, slightly lower than it should have been. Margaret watched all of this happen over the course of years, and she did not say anything, because saying something felt like a confrontation, and she had spent a lifetime avoiding confrontations about money. But she was watching, and somewhere in the quiet accumulation of those observations, a question began to form that she could not stop asking herself. If she handed each of her children a significant sum of money in their 50s, what would it actually do for them? Not financially. She had already thought through the financial dimensions carefully. What would it do to them, in the place where they lived inside their own stories about themselves? That question does not have a comfortable answer, and Margaret will be the first to tell you that she wrestled with it for years before she arrived at any kind of conclusion. She brought it to a therapist. She brought it to a financial advisor. She brought it to two close friends who were also in their late 70s and also watching their own children from the quiet vantage point that age provides. Every conversation added something. None of them resolved it cleanly. But slowly, over time, the shape of what she wanted to do became clearer, and the clarity did not feel like cruelty. It felt, she says, like the first honest conversation she had ever had with herself about what her money was actually for. There is research that supports the intuition Margaret was working from, even if she did not have access to it in the way a researcher would. Studies examining intergenerational wealth transfers have found that large inheritances can, in some cases, reduce the labor participation and savings behavior of recipients. The effect is not universal, and it is not inevitable, but it is documented, and it tends to be stronger when the inheritance arrives during the middle working years of the recipient's life rather than in old age. Margaret had read enough and observed enough to have her own version of this understanding, arrived at through watching rather than through reading. She had also been paying attention to something else. The way the anticipation of inheritance changes the texture of family relationships long before any money actually changes hands. She had seen this in her own family, and she had seen it in the families of friends. There is a particular kind of awkwardness that enters a room when aging parents and their adult children are together, and everyone is pretending not to be thinking about the same thing. The parents know. The children know the parents know. And the performance of not thinking about it, of being present purely for love and not for any other reason, requires a certain kind of sustained effort that eventually becomes its own kind of exhaustion. Margaret did not want to spend the final chapter of her life being uncertain about why her children called. She did not want to sit at holiday tables wondering whether the warmth around her was genuine or whether it was, at least in part, a long-term investment in goodwill. This is a thought that many older parents have, and almost none of them say out loud, because saying it out loud sounds uncharitable toward children who may in fact be calling purely out of love. But the thought is there, in many families, sitting quietly beneath the surface of perfectly normal Sunday dinners. Her decision to direct her estate to charitable causes was not made in anger. This is the part that people who hear her story struggle most to absorb. There was no single event that triggered it. There was no dramatic falling out, no betrayal, no moment of cruelty that snapped something shut inside her. What there was, instead, was a long, patient accumulation of clarity. She had watched her children build lives. She had watched them make choices. She had watched them become the specific adults they were going to be, and she had come to the conclusion that the people they were did not need what she had built in order to live well. They had enough. Maybe not abundantly. Maybe not without effort. But enough. And she had also come to believe, through a kind of moral reasoning that was entirely her own, that there were places in the world where $2.4 million would do something that was harder to quantify, but felt more real to her than adding a layer of financial cushion to 3 lives that already had cushion. She had identified a literacy organization working in under-resourced school districts. She had identified a medical research fund focused on a disease that had taken 2 people she loved before she understood what it was. She had identified a land preservation trust in the region where she had grown up. These were not abstract causes to her. They were the specific shape of what she decided her money meant. None of this made telling her children easy. She had planned the conversation carefully, or thought she had. She had prepared a letter explaining her reasoning. She had arranged to meet with each of them separately, so that no one would feel ambushed in front of a sibling. She had tried, as much as it is possible to try, to lead with love rather than with logic, because she understood that what she was about to say would be received not primarily as a financial statement, but as a statement about what she thought of them. And no amount of reasoning, however careful, can fully separate those 2 things in the mind of someone who is hearing for the first time that a parent has decided their life will not include something they had quietly counted on. David was the first to know. He is 53, works in commercial real estate, and has, by any external measure, done well for himself. Margaret describes him as competent and driven, and somewhat emotionally guarded in the way that men of his generation and professional background often are. She had always had to work a little harder to reach him, not because he was distant by nature, but because his way of processing difficulty was to go silent and work through it privately before bringing anything back to the surface. She had known this about him since he was a teenager. She sat across from him at a restaurant they had been going to together for many years and told him what she had decided. She walked him through her reasoning as carefully as she could, and she watched his face as she did it. He did not interrupt. He asked one clarifying question about whether the decision was legally final. She told him it was not yet signed, but that she had made up her mind. He nodded. They finished their meal. He hugged her in the parking lot with the same physical warmth he always had, and then he got in his car, and she did not hear from him for 11 days. When he finally called, the conversation was brief. He told her he respected her right to make the decision. He told her he did not agree with it. He told her that he needed more time. In the months that followed, their relationship did not break, but it changed in a way that Margaret notices every time they speak. There is something careful in his voice now that was not there before. A certain measuring. She does not know whether it is hurt or anger, or simply the adjustment a person makes when a story they had been telling themselves for a long time turns out to have a different ending. Carol's response was harder. Carol is 49, a former teacher who left the profession when her second child was born, and has since done a combination of part-time work and caregiving that she has found meaningful but financially limiting. Of the 3 children, Carol is the one whose circumstances made the anticipated inheritance feel less like a windfall and more like a safety net, and Margaret knows this. It was the part of her decision she returned to most often in her own private deliberations, and it was the part she still turns over in her mind when she wakes at 3 in the morning, and the house is quiet, and the full weight of what she has done is present without any softening. Carol's letter was not cruel in the way that cruelty is usually understood. It was not full of name-calling or threats. It was full of grief, which is actually harder to read than anger, because grief does not give you anything to push against. Carol wrote that she had always assumed her mother understood what her life looked like from the inside. She wrote that the decision felt like a verdict. She wrote that she did not understand how someone could love their children and simultaneously look at their lives and decide that strangers deserved more consideration than the people they had raised. That sentence, Margaret says, is the one she has read most often since. Not because it changed her mind, but because she wanted to understand it fully, from the inside, the way Carol had meant it. Thomas drove from Pittsburgh without calling first. He arrived on a Saturday morning when Margaret was in her garden, which is where she spends most of her mornings when the weather permits. He came through the gate at the side of the house, and she looked up and knew immediately from his face that he had already heard, most likely from Carol, because the siblings share information the way siblings do, and Margaret had perhaps been naive to think that 3 separate conversations would remain separate for very long. They sat at the outdoor table, and he asked her directly if it was true. She told him it was. He asked her why. She began to explain. He listened for approximately 20 minutes, and then he put his hand up in a gesture she had never seen him use before, and said he needed to leave. He drove home to Pittsburgh. He has since been in intermittent contact, but it is different now. The ease that used to be there between them is working its way back slowly, but it is work, and they both know it. What happened to Margaret's family is not unique to her, and it is not unique to families of significant wealth. Research published across several family psychology and financial planning journals has documented the same pattern repeatedly. The disclosure of an inheritance decision that departs from what adult children expected tends to produce a grief response that closely mirrors the grief produced by other kinds of loss. The expectation, once formed, has a reality in the mind of the person holding it that makes its absence feel like something that was taken rather than simply never given. This is one of the most important things to understand about why these conversations go the way they go. The children in stories like Margaret's are not, in most cases, greedy people. They are people who built an internal picture of their future that included a certain element, and who are now being asked to revise that picture in middle age, when revision is harder than it is when you are young and everything is still malleable. The financial loss is real for some of them, but in many cases, the emotional loss is larger, because what the inheritance represented was not just money. It was evidence. It was a parent saying, in the most concrete language available, "Here is what you were worth to me." Margaret understands this, and she says it plainly. She says that this is exactly why she wrote the letter she wrote to each of her children, explaining not the numbers but the meaning. She wanted them to know that her decision said nothing about what they were worth to her. It said something about what money was and was not capable of expressing. She had tried, over the course of raising them, to show them what they were worth in every way that she could, and she would continue to try for whatever time remained. But she was not going to use her estate as the final statement of that value, because she did not believe money was the right language for the thing she wanted to say. She is not certain she has convinced any of them of this. She may never know. The honest truth about decisions like the one she made is that their full consequence exists mostly in the future, in conversations and silences and moments of closeness or distance that have not happened yet. She will not be there to see most of it. The children she raised will carry this forward in whatever way they carry it, and it will become part of the story they tell about their childhoods and their mother and what family meant in the particular version of it they grew up inside. What she says she knows for certain is this. She is 79 years old. She has worked for more than 50 years. She has paid attention to her own life with more care than most people pay attention to theirs. And she has arrived at the conclusion, through honest reckoning rather than through bitterness, that the best use of everything she built is not to soften the future for people who already have a future. It is to do something more precise. To find the specific corners of the world where the resources she accumulated can make a difference that cannot be made any other way, and to put them there while she still can, while she is still alive to understand the choice she is making and to mean it fully. She does not ask her children to agree with her. She does not ask anyone to agree with her. She asks only that people understand that this is what love looked like for her at this stage of her life, wearing this particular form, making this particular choice. That a person can give everything they have to the world and still mean it as an act of love toward the people sitting at their kitchen table is not a contradiction, even if it feels like one. Even if it takes years to stop feeling like one. even if it never fully stops. Margaret Ellison is still in her garden on Saturday mornings. She still answers the phone when her children call. She still cooks dinner for Thomas on the occasions when he makes the drive from Pittsburgh, and she still sets a place for Carol whenever she comes, and she still saves the coffee that David likes when she knows he is visiting. The money will go where she decided it will go. The dinners, for now, continue. She is not sure which of those facts matters more. She suspects the answer changes depending on which morning you ask her, and she has made peace with not knowing. That, she says, is the honest truth of where she is. That, and nothing more, is what she has to offer anyone who is still listening.